Good evening. It's really a privilege to be here with you all tonight. My relationship with Cornerstone started when my daughter invited me to go to the women's missions trip to Hungary, as Angela alluded to. And it was amazing. First of all, it was where my heart was because we were ministering to Ukrainian refugees, so you can imagine. But that trip turned out to be quite an adventure that has not stopped since then. So I just am really, really happy to be here. I have a disclosure to make. I am not a speaker. I have shared my story multiple times, but always in small groups like Bible studies. So this is a virgin voyage for me. Have mercy, please. I also have a prayer request for all of the multi-processors in the audience. Can you please do me a favor? While you're listening, can you please pray that the words out of my mouth decrease and the message from God through my words increases? So thank you. I'm already mixed up. When I first heard the clear gospel message in my early 20s, the idea of salvation and eternal life was very inviting. But actually what captured my heart was that God of the universe loved me so much that he not only knit me in my mother's womb, but he continued to actually walk beside me every day of my life, guiding my steps, intervening when necessary to direct my path in the way that he wanted me to go. And that wasn't always the path I wanted to go, but there was definitely intervention. He continually thinks about us. You just need to realize that. And he does that for every one of us, all of us. Psalm 22 says, "Yet you brought me safely from my mother's womb. You led me to trust you when I was a nursing infant." Can you imagine? "I was thrust into your arms at my birth, and you have been my God from the moment I was born." Isn't that beautiful? It clearly says that even an infant, before I had the ability to think, before I could logically or even emotionally accept the Lord, he had already being my God. Looking back at some of the events in my life, I realized that if God had not actively been present and intentionally intervening, any one of these events left to itself would have created a different outcome. I would not be standing here in front of you, probably. I have two messages for you today. One is God cares. He really cares. Very intimately, and even more intentionally than you can imagine. God walks with us constantly, even when we don't notice. He protects, he guides, and he provides. And you will see this throughout my father's story. The second is that there are many good people in the world, throughout the world, but many of them, so many of them, are in America because our nation was founded on biblical principles. My story starts with my father and 3 generations of family caught in a revolution and later in a world war. All of that was beyond their control. Yet looking back on the story, you'll see places where God provided protection, intervention, guidance, and provision. There was a multitude of opportunities that the family never dreamed would be available to them. Russia in the early 1900s was ruled over Ukraine, and Tsar Nicholas II was the ruler. Ukraine is a very fertile agricultural country. It has the 6th most fertile soil in the world. At that time, it was populated by large, wealthy farm estates, and they hired families, poor families, to work the farm and maintain it. Most of those families lived right on the farm, all their life. They were married, they raised their children. It was home for them. My grandfather was one of those wealthy estate owners. He was kind and cared for the people who worked for him as if they were extended family. I knew that personally when I went back to the Ukraine when it was free, and we went back to where the estate was when he was a child, and people now, second generation, still talked about Didenko, who owned the farm, and how kind and good he was. In fact, they said, this is a rabbit trail already. So, but he said, one of the women said, whenever the neighbors argued, some neighbor would come along and stop the argument because they said, you are trampling on Didenko's soul, stop it. That's quite a testimony for a man that I don't even know that he knew the Lord. He was just a kind man. In 1980, when the Bolsheviks took power and tried to form communism, which was, of course, the governing model was that everything was owned and taken and run by a central government, they knew that they were going to have problems with the landowners of these estates. So the strategy was proactively squelch any resistance as quickly as possible. So what they would do is they would ride in at night into an estate or a farm, and they would go to the mansion, and they would arrest the owner of the mansion and any male 18 or over, and take the family, the siblings and the women, and put them in the poorest house on the estate to fend for themselves. In 1927, I wanted to tell you there were scenes in Dr. Zhivago that had that, if any of you have seen Dr. Zhivago. The Bolsheviks rode in to my grandfather's estate in 1927, seized the estate. My grandfather and my father were arrested and imprisoned, and my grandmother and the two young siblings were kicked out of the house. Life in prison was pretty structured. The older men stayed in prison, locked up, but the younger men, they used as help in the operations of the prison. So those younger men had jobs. They would work in the office, or they would work loading supplies or running errands. One night, my father's cellmate came back to the cell and said, Yura, your father is on the list. It was a kind of a punch in the stomach moment, of course, but everybody knew what that meant. And so my father found some way to the next day, as he was doing errands, to come around to his father's cell. And if you can imagine this 18-year-old saying, Dad, you're on the list for tonight. I heard that story thousands of times over my lifetime. I never could picture myself in my father's shoes and how he ever did it. In fact, at one time, I said, Dad, what did you say to each other? And he looked at me with sad tears in his eyes, and he said, honey, what was there to say? We said a few words of endearment. We hugged. We cried. And then I walked away. That night, they heard the clanging of the prison doors, and they heard them opening, and then they heard the herding of the men as they were driven out of their cells. And then after a while, the noise stopped, and there was just a barrage of gunfire. And then there was silence. My father, at this point, was the oldest surviving male in the family. And so according to culture, the Ukrainian culture, he was now in charge. He knew he had to try to get out of prison, because his mother and his two siblings were trying to survive, and they had no means. The only way to be released out of prison for those young men was if they would deny their family name and then sign a paper that said that their father was an evil man that took advantage of the common person, and that he was an enemy of the state and of the present government that was in charge. Of course, my father did it. He had to sign that paper. He had to get out. For the next 15 years, he spent those 15 years finding jobs, and whatever he earned, he was trying to help his mother and his two young siblings survive. But the way they had to do it was that they found designated places in the woods where he would hide whatever he had for that week or that 2 weeks in a designated place, and she later would come and pick it up when he was gone. They rarely saw each other because it was such a risk. Along the way, as the years passed, he rose professionally, and he found stability in the forestry operation, which was the second largest industry in Ukraine. He always was hiding his true identity because a label, if that was found out, was like, I think in America it would be like being a felon. And so he tried to hide his true identity and never joined the Communist Party, no matter how many times he was invited. As the years passed, he had the luxury of also building a life for himself. He got married, he settled in a home, and life wasn't bad, except that he had this rock, this guilt, emotion deep in his stomach that he really couldn't get rid of. World War II broke out, and there was a German invasion of Russia, as you all know. The Germans marched into Ukraine, and they were greeted with open arms as liberators because the Ukrainians really wanted to be independent, and they thought that this was the door to that. So what did my father do immediately? He wanted to get rid of this guilt. He wanted to get rid of the pit in his stomach. So he went to his superiors, and he told them who he was. And he told them that his father was one of the kindest estate owners that he knew. And then, of course, he got fired. But he didn't care about that. He was okay with the way he was living. He knew he could find another job. But that wasn't enough. He took an ad out in the local newspaper to say the same thing. So now it's public information. And the beauty of it was he really felt better, and the knot was gone because he felt like he vindicated his father. Well, history played a trick on him. The Germans start to retreat. You know, it was a harsh Russian winter that the Germans weren't prepared for. And of course, as they retreated, my father had two choices. He either had to stay, and he probably would be arrested and executed, or he could try to escape with the German front as they were retreating, and the Russians were advancing, and there was many people who at that point were trying to move between that, with the retreating with the German front, just trying to get out. Of course, my mother was now pregnant, 6 months. He had to go to her, and he told her what was happening, and he said, "You can stay here in the village. You will be safe. The baby will be safe. I know that for a fact because you have 3 brothers, and the culture in Ukraine was, if there was the extended family was very strong. If something tragic happened to one of the families, the extended family just filled in the hole, and they would have provided very well for my mother and I." Or he said, the second, I can hardly ask you this, but if you would like to come, with me, you need to understand the danger. You can imagine, you're on the military front the whole time you're traveling, as these two fronts are intersecting. Fortunately for me, and my sweet husband, she chose to go with him. So it was a 2-year journey. It was a covered wagon, freezing winter. It started with 2 strong horses and 2 other families that had wagons to form a caravan. My father mostly walked from the Ukraine across Europe into Germany on foot, because the Germans early on in the journey took our strong horses and left us ponies, weak horses, behind for us to use. We continued on our journey, camping in the forest, in the snow, cooking on open fires, sleeping under wagons. Well, the time had come and the labor pain began. My mother started with the labor pains in the morning, but they were still traveling. They couldn't stop. It was bitter cold, she said. It was snowing. And she said her teeth were chattering so much that she had to clench them to just hope that they wouldn't chip. And she couldn't even tell whether it was the cold or whether it was actually the labor pains that was causing it. By the time evening fell, my father came to a farmhouse and asked if he could use the farmer's barn, explained the situation, and the farmer said, well, of course, I would love to have you, but they're German soldiers that are occupying that barn. You should try to talk to the commanding officer and see if he will let you at least carve out a part of the barn for yourselves for overnight. So my father went to find the commanding officer, and the man had such mercy on us that he literally moved his soldiers out and gave us the whole barn. We had all the hay we wanted, even a bench, no hot water, no sterilization, but it was a very natural childbirth. No clean clothes to wrap the baby in. The men in the caravan were literally shaking out their undershirts, trying to see if it was clean enough, and especially making sure that there were no fleas. I guess it all went well because I'm standing here. So I was born at 11 o'clock at night. We settled into the hay overnight. I didn't know enough what was going on, but from what I heard, they got through the night. And early the next morning, the wagons had to move again. So my mother didn't even have 24 hours before she was bouncing in the wagon again. The days that followed, you can see why I admire my mother. The days that followed, my mother's milk dried up because she was a petite woman anyway, but with the kind of limited diet that they were having, you can see why it would be hard for her to nurse the baby. But she would beg cups of milk from the farmer as they went along the way at different farms. And then she would take cheesecloth and wind it really tight so it was long, and she would dip it into the cup and then let me suck on it. And that's how we got milk in it. My other great staple in my diet was chocolate. There were German soldiers who, when they heard a baby cry, sometimes were curious, sometimes they wanted to help, but they would drop by. And if there was a baby or children, they usually had sweets, but mostly chocolate. So my mother, believe it or not, my mother would chew up the chocolate like a mama bird and then feed it to me. Look at me. Do I look like I'm thin and skinny? So again, Pampers, diapers. My diapers were old clothing cut into the right size cloth. She washed the dirty diapers in a puddle or in a well, if she could find one. And then she would wring them out and put them next to her skin, hoping that it would dry in time for the next change. I just want you, I get overwhelmed just hearing myself talk. So you can just see already the protection that God provided for me when I didn't know him. It's just astounding to me. Later, when I was a few months old, the wagon caravan was fording a river with very strong currents. Our weak horses, as you remember, were struggling to cross the river. They slipped, and our wagon tipped over. Most of our belongings fell out and were floating down the river. The men were busy calming the horses and trying to upright the wagon. The women were really trying to grab anything that was floating or was stuck by the shoreline. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, there's a cry. And it's my mother saying, "Where's the baby? I don't have the baby." Well, this was a panic. I mean, can you imagine? I'm talking and I'm thinking, are you crazy? I don't believe I'm saying this, but I know it's true. And so there were the women that were running. One of the ladies was running along the shoreline, and she saw a bundle caught in a bush that the branches were leaning into the water. And she saw something that was kind of stuck in the branches. So she was grabbing it, thinking it was a duffel bag or something. And she goes, "Here she is." I think I was upright, floating. But there was no crying. I was still peacefully sleeping. Born in a barn, found floating in the water among some rushes. Does that sound familiar? Of any Bible story you might know? I don't want to say this, but God just led me to say this. I think he loves all of you, but I think I'm his favorite. I mean, it's either that or I'm his most challenged one, and I keep him busy, which is, I think, what it is from birth. Being caught in the crossfire was routine for them. And when the crossfire, whether it was missile shelling or crossfire, everyone scattered for shelter, running towards anything that even looked like shelter, slipping, falling, knee-deep in snow. The winter we just had was like spring in the Ukrainian or Russian winters. My mother would quickly bundle me up and try to run, carry me, slipping, falling. By the time she found shelter, the shooting and danger was over. So after a few times of that, she just gave up trying to run. She just sat in the wagon, holding me tight, praying that God, if anything hit the wagon, that it would kill both of us. She didn't want one of us surviving without the other. And to tell you how dangerous it really was, one time after an aerial attack, she came out from outside from the wagon where she and I were, to find a bull which was grazing about 50 yards away under a tree, lying dead. So if you want to know about protection, that's my first word with a capital P. He definitely provides protection. He provides provision, and he certainly guides us. You see how much protection and provision God has given me in my life. There were many challenges on the road, but I could keep you here all night. But one especially I want to share, because it truly shows how God intervenes. At one point, we were crossing in Czechoslovakia and were caught by the Russian soldiers. They put us in boxcars, and there was no train engine, so they just kept us in boxcars for a couple of days, waiting for a train engine to come and pull us back to the homeland, which definitely meant that we were finished as part of any hope of ever getting out of Ukraine. In fact, probably had no hope of surviving unless we went to Siberia, and then we would die there. But because the engine didn't come, they had to move us into temporary barracks that were empty, and they had a barbed wire all around the barrack. So there was only one gate that you can come out of. My father, when wandering around, found a hole in the fence somewhere, and he decided to sneak out and see if there was any possibility of getting out or any rescue. He came back in a couple days, and he quietly said, to the other two families, pack up your bag, pack up the wagons, we're gonna try to get out. They drive 3 loaded wagons up to the guardhouse, and the young guard at the gate says, I can't let you out. You need to have written permission to get out of here. And my father says, well, could I just leave all these wagons here while I go to the administrative office and ask for permission? And the guard said, sure. So he goes down into the direction of the administrative office, goes around the corner behind a building, stands there for a while, pondering. I hope he was praying. He had to be praying when you hear the rest of the story. And he comes back and he says, I have to read this because I can't even believe it. He said to the officer, you had no mean that the officer had no means of issuing formal written permission because it was Sunday and the clerical staff was not in the office. But he was giving a verbal directive to the guard via my father to let us go. All right, do you want to believe? Would you believe a story like that? I mean, you know the answer because I'm standing here. The guard opened the gate. The wagon drivers whipped those horses into high speed and only stopped after they were deep in the woods. They wouldn't have even stopped then, except the horses were frothing at the mouth. I gotta get busy, I've lost track now. They hid in the forest a few days and then backtracked to the village that they had been to, that actually, where the mayor was very sympathetic to refugees, and they found some rest there. That is called divine intervention. Is it similar to God parting the Red Sea for the children of Israel? It truly is a miracle on display. And I am so thankful for all the stories I have, and each one is connected to a character of God and how he was intervening in our lives and how he was guiding us. The war, after many miles of travel, many more challenges, and many more months of camping outdoors, sleeping under wagons in any kind of weather, one night, life changed for them. The rifle gunshots in the woods was kind of routine for them to expect. So at first, when they settled in, they didn't really think much of it. But hearing the guns at night, these were different. They were more frightening. The bullets were bouncing off the trees. They seemed especially close, and worst of all, they were continuous all night. It was a long night, no one slept, and the wagon caravan left at dawn as soon as it was light. As they left the forest, they were stopped by a group of soldiers that just happened to be American. The soldiers told them that the war was over. Now that was a surprise for them because they only got information from each other when they met other wagon caravans. They said that they were the ones that were doing the shooting all night because they were trying to smoke out any last remnants of the German soldiers that might be in the woods. And then they asked where my parents were going, and they said they were just trying to escape Russia, and they were escaping refugees. So he gave them some documents that actually was permission for them to go to a refugee camp in Augsburg, and he gave them directions. It was just half a day's travel, gave them directions on how to get there. That again, God provided a way for us because unknowingly, we ended up in the Allied section of Germany under Allies occupation. If that was West Germany. If we had ended up, and there's no reason, it was luck of the draw, if we had ended up in Eastern Germany, controlled and occupied by Russia, we would have met different soldiers, and we would have been directed to a different refugee camp. Russians, even at that time, were shipping the refugee people back to the homeland. Their fate would never be known. So you can see the gratitude that I have for what God did for me before I couldn't even believe in him. I couldn't even accept him. It's just amazing. I'm going to kind of skip the refugee camp because I have so much to say that's on my heart. It was a semi-dorm style living. It was a room about like a big, large classroom, and there were 4 families in that room. There was one in each corner, and they had a privacy curtain that you could draw, and then you were scheduled to cook and eat in a mass dining room. You signed up for laundry, and everybody had a garden plot, and the men were assigned jobs where they could actually earn money to continue to support the family. So life was kind of, we were there for almost 4 years. So life was safe, but it was still unsettling because we didn't know where we were heading. There were people coming from other countries to offer to sponsor the refugees for certain occupations that they needed in their own countries. And so slowly, these people were leaving the camp as they found jobs and immigrated for a new life. Finally, late December 1948, the officials from the U.S. Agriculture Association arrived looking to sponsor people to do farm work. My father went to sign up and was immediately chosen. A farmer in Maryland sponsored our voyage in exchange for my parents both working on his farm. Suddenly, everything happened in unprecedented speed. Within 3 weeks, we found ourselves traveling once more, packed up, but this time by boat across an ocean in the winter again. It was January 7th, 1949. I remember it well when we boarded the boat that was sailing for America, because it was the Ukrainian Orthodox Christmas. And I was 4.5, and St. Nick was supposed to come. So I definitely cried that night. But then I had other reasons to cry very soon. It was an 11-day journey that felt like an eternity because the weather was so bitter and cold, and the rough water, it was so stormy. The ship rocked continually as if it was a small motorboat, as that high, huge, icy ocean waves just overpowered and crossed the bow of the ship and splashed on the deck. It was so bad that in the dining room, they had tied the chairs, the legs of the chairs to the leg of the table, so it was more of a mass and was heavy. And even then, those mass of chair groupings slid around like marbles on that dining room. The men's quarters and the women's quarters were separated. My mother and I went to sleep that first night. I thought everything was okay, until I woke up in the middle of the night and I heard this growling and roaring and sounds that were just gurgling. I didn't know what they were. It had to be animals. And so I started to cry for my mother, and my mother wasn't there. But this lady came and she comforted me and stayed with me, and she said, "Your father will pick you up in the morning." And he did. And after that, my father picked me up every morning and dropped me off every night. And I never saw my mother again except once. She was so seasick that she could not stay. She had to be in the fresh air. And they literally put her out on the deck and had chairs to protect her, and then a tarp on that. Of course, I didn't know any of this until the one day my father got me bundled up, and a guy in uniform came, and fortunately my father was big and muscular, and so was this guy. He was probably the captain. And they took me outside, and they literally had to hold on to me because I would have blown away. And the only thing I still remember of that windy walk on the deck was that it was raining, and the raindrops were so cold and icy that they felt like pin needles on my cheeks, that I almost can feel that same feeling if I concentrate. But I saw my mother, and she was lying very still on the deck, looking very weak, pale, and almost gray. It was years later that my mother said that the reason I was there was that she continually begged the captain to let her see me one more time because she was sure she was dying. So it was traumatic for me, but it obviously was even more traumatic for my mother because she was really suffering. We landed in Boston finally. The ambulance was waiting for my mother at the hospital. And the next day, fortunately, the doctor said that she was really probably just hydrated. So she was well enough to travel with us on the train when we were going to Maryland, where the farm was that we were supposed to work. Halfway there, though, my mother got sick again. So the train made an emergency stop in Maryland. And she was, not Maryland, in Baltimore. And she was hospitalized again as my father and I continued on the train and traveled to Princess Anne. And now again, it was just my father and I. He was all I had to cling to in this strange country, knowing nothing, feeling very insecure. We arrived at the farm, and the sun was setting, and there was this pond there. And it was probably shallow because there were cattails over right where the sun set, and they were going down. And I felt so lost and so small. And my father took my hand, and this tiny hand, a 4.5-year-old hand, was swimming in this big, it was like a palm. My father was such a big guy. He was tall, he was 6'2", and he was muscular and well-built, and he literally took my hand, and it was swimming, his huge hand. It was just swimming in his. My hand was just swimming in his. And I looked up at him, and he had this military jacket on that I don't even know where he had gotten. He probably bartered for it somewhere. And I looked up at him, and I thought, you are so big. We're going to be all right. And that was a message God gave me, a child wanting some security. And I found it in a towering man that was my father. At the farm, farming, of course, is hard work. It's from sunrise to sunset. But we were grateful for a house. At least we had a roof. When the year's obligation was up, we left. We decided to leave and head for Philadelphia because Philadelphia had started to have a Ukrainian little colony forming. And as the year ended, there were a lot of refugees that were ending their obligation, had fulfilled their obligation, and they were just all kind of gravitating to Philadelphia. There were other cities that they also gravitated to. But it was because I think it wasn't that farm life was so hard, as they just missed hearing their language. They missed their friends. And most of all, I think they missed their culture. And so when my parents got in touch with some friends in Philadelphia, they had a little apartment, but they said it was just a little bigger than what we had in the refugee camp. But they said, come, we'll do it together until you find a job and you end up on your feet. So we decided jobs were hard to find. It was mostly second shifts in factories. But again, God is about to provide. Mrs. Scott of Scott Paper Company lived in a 250-acre estate in Philadelphia. Her husband had started Scott Paper Company, so they were pretty wealthy. She needed to farm a large portion of that estate for tax purposes, and she was looking for somebody to do that. We left our shared apartment in Philadelphia to our next adventure in the American suburbs. I don't remember Mrs. Scott as being a particularly warm person, But she was a kind, caring, and sensitive person, almost regal, in that she had really snowy white hair pulled back in a bun, petite woman, but you could tell that she was strong. Over the years, she became a generous benefactor to our family and an American grandma to us, the children, because she let us play in her barn and in her gardens, and actually provided the only presents we got at Christmas in those early years. We lived in a house on the edge of her estate, and she allowed my father to almost have a mini farm there, because she allowed him to have chickens and pigs and vegetable gardens. That was home for my whole American childhood. And what a childhood it was. It was not easy being an immigrant family in the suburbs, especially for a teenager who was trying desperately to be American. When you had to deliver eggs because you were selling eggs to the neighbors or the neighboring families, and the guy that, as a teenager at 13, I had a crush on, I had to deliver eggs to his house. That is the one time I prayed to God, please don't let him answer the door. Our first night at the house, we slept on the floor because we had no beds. We had no furniture. We just had our clothing, our bedding, and some kitchen utensils. Mrs. Scott had paid for a man to move us from Philadelphia, and she was there to greet us with all our belongings. And as the conversation progressed, she finally asked the man, "Are you going back to get the rest of their stuff?" And he said, "No, ma'am, this is all they have." So Mrs. Scott looked shocked, but said nothing. But 3 days later, a truck arrived from the Salvation Army with a bed, a dresser, kitchen table set, and a sofa. I'm going to jump to my second message. This is the American heart. You guys, you Americans, Native Americans, are so generous and so loving. This is the first, this to me, it's such a symbol of what you all do every day. The people in the neighborhood were very kind and came to greet us. But of course, the conversation was limited to hello, thank you, and goodbye, with a lot of interspersed smiles and hand gestures. But these were the same American neighbors that over time generously filled our whole house with furniture and house items that they no longer needed, but they knew we did. And that's what I'm talking about. And that's why I'm so touched by you all. Life was still changing, but we were delighted to feel safe. And now we were settled. We knew that this was our home. Within 3 years, the first 3 years, 2 little sisters arrived on the scene. My mother worked in a second shift in a factory, so she left for work soon after I could get home from school. I was the babysitter. I was the chief bottle washer and a stoker of a wood-burning stove in the kitchen until my father came home from milking the cows at 6 o'clock. Mind you, I was in 3rd grade. By this time, I was the only one in the family who could speak fluent, simple conversational English. So I was the translator for the family when it came to interacting with the outside world, shopping, doctor's visits, and legal paperwork, like doing my father's taxes. We never got audited. But then he didn't make enough to get audited. So I grew up very quickly with a lot of adult responsibilities. School studies were a very high priority for my father. Any ambition that my father may have had personally, coming to America at 40 years old, was blocked by insurmountable hurdles, as you can imagine. He knew that he could not do it, but he bracketed all those ambitions and poured them into the first people that he thought could do it, his 3 little girls. He was determined that his daughters would have an opportunity to achieve a level of dreams no longer available to him. His mantra to us growing up was, the streets in America really are paved with gold. They are just under a lot of dirt. You're going to have to dig deep, and it's going to be hard to reach it. Your shovel is the college education, and you need a scholarship, so get busy. I learned that mantra very early in life because I remember entering kindergarten not knowing it. I was, at that point, 5. I didn't know a word of English when I entered. And so, again, I'm all alone with all these children who are ignoring me. So I sat down against a wall, just huddled up against the wall on the floor, and my kindergarten teacher came, and she said something. It was kind. I could tell it was kind because it was a soft voice. And I went, and she looked at me kindly, and she patted me on the head and kissed me on the forehead and walked away. My next flashback was me going the first day to first grade saying, Mrs. Putt, I need a scholarship for college. Can you help me get all stars? You are all laughing. The funny thing is that if I did that, if the child did that today, they would be in a child psychology office so fast their head would spin. But in those days, I got passed on in elementary school, from first grade to second grade to third grade. Every teacher knew my story, and every teacher tried to help me. But that's where the mantra started, way back then. My life was, as you can tell, was a stream of happy and sad events. But fortunately, the happy ones are the ones you really remember, and the sad ones just become things you laugh at. Many were extraordinary, like I told you about my teachers. Miss Reese, who also was my guidance counselor, she knew I would never go to visit any colleges. So when a college representative would come, she would pull me out of class, but she only had me see those for an automatic interview, those that she thought I could get a full scholarship, not just tuition, because I needed room and board. So I got 4 scholarships. And so I, even as an American, had a choice, which was lovely. I didn't expect that. But they were all full rides, which, again, thank you, you Americans. In school was a family project. And if I got a good grade, if I got an award, I would come home and find my father plowing in the fields, and I would go find him because I wanted to show him, because I knew that he would tear up. He would be so touched and so proud he would tear up. So I literally lived to see my father cry. I'm telling you, I just knew how important it was to him. And so growing up, that was one of the things that I treasured most about what happened. One of the sad things that can happen to immigrants is, of course, we get hand-me-down clothes. So sometimes Christmas came in July when we got 3 bags of clothes for the girls. And one time I was in 5th grade. I'll never forget this. It was this beautiful dress, and it fit me. It was one of the kids, the family that gave it, obviously had outgrown it. And I put it on, and I felt like a princess. And I went to school thinking, I look like an American. And as I was proudly walking around, one of the girls in my class said, "What are you doing with my dress on?" That was, yes. Yes. I mean, that's when my father comforted me instead, because I was crying. But the same mantra existed. He repeated that, except he added another sentence that said, "Don't you worry, honey. Someday, when you make it, they will all want to be your friends." And look, will you all be my friend? I do need you. So I'm almost finished. I'm sorry. I lost track of time completely. I told you I was the first time. My life was an intersection of spheres. It was a Ukrainian immigrant culture that we went to on weekends and holidays, to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Philadelphia. There was an American suburb culture, which I've already shared, so I'll only say that I was striving to fit in. And you know, those old habits don't change. Some of you know, because you've had lunch with me, I'm still striving to become an American, even though I am a naturalized citizen. But there's just something, you know, from childhood. Then there was this taste of off-the-charts wealthy culture that seemed like a fantasy from Mrs. Scott's world and her friends. I was sometimes invited into that world, believe it or not, and I'll just give you one example. Picture little orphan Annie, where she was having dinner with Daddy Warbuck, the wealthy millionaire benefactor. Sometimes in the summer, my father, this is just one example, my father would come home at lunch and he'd go, "You need to be ready at 4 or 5 o'clock, get dressed up, because Walter is coming to pick you up to have dinner with Mrs. Scott." Now, I'm probably 8, 7, and Walter was her chauffeur, and he would drive up in this big black Cadillac. In those days, that was really something, I guess. And so he was a great guy. He was this jolly, robust African-American with a smile on his face. And when he really wanted to treat me, he would let me sit up front in the seat with him. But most of the time, he said I needed to learn how to be a lady, and he put me in the back. But we would always drive to the kitchen door, and then we would go in the kitchen entrance, and there would be Alex the butler and Alice the cook. And if Mrs. Scott wasn't ready to see me or not ready for dinner, then we hung around together at the kitchen table, discussed who knows what, but they laughed a lot. I do remember we laughed a lot. But what conversation do you have with a 6 to 8-year-old, right? But the bell would ring, which meant Mrs. Scott was ready, and you'd come into her dining room, and she was sitting at this long table. She was sitting at the head, and I would sit right beside her, lost in the dining room chairs that she had. We had wonderful discussions because she kept inviting me back. So, and if she was really interested in whatever discussion we were having, we would have dessert in her parlor with the fireplace on. But if she'd had enough of me, then I was dismissed from the dining room. But no. But then it was fun because Walter and Alice and Alex weren't finished with me yet. So then we laughed some more until they got tired of me, and then I got to go home. Now that is a really sweet story. And that tells you, again, the generous heart of you American people. Now you're really gonna know. This is my last story. This is probably the most significant provision from God and a final example of the excessive generosity of an American heart. It is in the DNA of the American culture. I know that for a fact. One day, Mrs. Scott told my father not to come to work the next day, but to get dressed up and get ready for Walter to pick him up, and to also bring me along. Okay. Walter and Mrs. Scott came in the car, in the Cadillac, next day, picked us up, and Mrs. Scott explained that we were going to the courthouse to conduct some business. The clerk at the courthouse, after we arrived, explained to my father that Mrs. Scott was selling him a plot of land, and he needed to sign some papers, and then told him to pay Mrs. Scott $1 for the property. Even though I was almost a teenager and by now was very fluent in English, this was very hard to translate in a way that made any sense to my father or to me. Mind you, I was 12 years old then. However, my father had learned to trust Mrs. Scott and obediently gave the $1, and we got back in the car. And Mrs. Scott explained that she knew when she died the estate would be sold to a land developer. And she wanted to make sure that we were all provided for. So she had taken and surveyed an acre of land on the edge of her property. And she said it was not his now, but when she died, it would become his. And it came with instructions. She said that when I die, I want you to take that land, and I want you to sell half of it. And you take the money from the half you sell, and you build yourself a house on the remaining acre. She did exactly that. She died, Mrs. Scott died 5 years later, and my father did exactly that. And I forgot to tell you, one more thing. It's very little. And she said, you need a job, George. You need a job. So when I die, she had Scott Foundation horticultural gardens. She loved flowers at Swarthmore College, which was just down the road from us. And she said, you have a guaranteed job there the day I die. So she died 5 years later. My father worked at Swarthmore College until he was 70 and lived in that little ranch house until he died when he was 89. And my sister still lives in that house. So that actually, so now, Angela, it's only 2 pages. This is just a short epilogue that I just need to leave you with. For me, Mrs. Scott, I might have to just read it because otherwise I'll have rabbit trails. For me, Mrs. Scott's tender generosity embraces all that I think America as a culture is, even today. She's the poster child of who you all are as a people and a nation. This is very personal to me. I think God planned the United States to be an experiment in Christian living. You people are a chosen people by God to build and maintain a nation, a culture founded on Christian biblical principles. Don't forget, the Pilgrims came here to have freedom to worship their God. You are unique as a nation, loving and serving those less fortunate than you. George Mardikin, a Turkish immigrant who became a philanthropist, once said, you who are born in America will never know what it means not to be an American. But you will never have the glorious experience of becoming an American. We, me, who are naturalized citizens, all feel the same way. I don't think there's never been a naturalization ceremony in the country that there were no tears shed. As soon as my parents were eligible, they applied for citizenship. When I turned 16, my father took me to Philadelphia to take my naturalization test, and then he took me to see the Liberty Bell. I stand here before you filled with deep gratitude to God and to you, the American people, for all the abundance I have experienced in my personal life, both spiritually, materially, and the absolutely amazing family, husband and children, and married children and grandchildren that he has given me. I am so grateful for all that I have experienced in America these past 77 years. Human kindness and generosity is inherent in your American culture. It is in your DNA as a people. Sometimes, all the divisiveness of the world today, I think it is easy for you all to forget who you actually are. How very generous, kind, and very loving you've been as a nation to many other nations in the world, and as a people, to people that come to your shores and into your neighborhoods. And you still continue to be. We must keep stoking and rekindling that spirit that's in you by living out our biblical principles and living our lives rooted in the Lord. Please cling to the fact that you still stand on the rock-solid foundation of being one nation under God. Never forget, walk out your faith with him. It is a privilege at the very core of this wonderful country. And remember, it is only on America and on its people that God has lavished this kind of abundance. I'm finished. Thank you. I do. Oh, no. Thank you. Thank you. You know, when I was a dentist, I felt like I had 3,400 friends. Every patient, they came in twice a year, we would catch up. They mostly weren't in pain. And now look, God has provided again. Thank you. I would just like to have a short prayer to thank God. Oh, my Lord Jesus, Father God, how did I ever deserve to be your child? How did I ever deserve the abundance of your love? How could I ever even try to love you back in the way that you're loving us? How can I try to show my gratefulness? I thank you for all the women today that allowed me to ramble, to allow me to pour out my heart. I am so grateful for this room filled with Christian women who are following you and loving you. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity that I really did get through speaking. Thank you, Lord. In Jesus' name, I pray.